It is December 12th, 2024, and Kiev's military is sounding the alarm, warning that Russian forces are within 3 kilometers of their key strategic hub of Pokrovsk in the Donbass region. And instead of, sending more reinforcements or trying to help Kiev's forces on the ground, what is the West doing? Oh, well, the US is helping Kiev, or more specifically, they are the ones carrying out yet another direct attack on Russian territory using US made ATACMS, this time targeting southern Russia. And you've got the Kremlin vowing that there will be a response. You've also got some anonymous US officials freaking out and wondering if that response will include an attack using Russia's brand new Oreshnik missile. Certainly a lot to keep an eye on here, and we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know that the Ukrainian military is sounding the alarm that Russian forces are within just 3 kilometers of Pokrovsk in the Donbass, which is, of course, a key strategic hub for Kiev. And you've got General Alexander Syrskyi claiming that Kiev will be making, quote, unconventional decisions to bolster Ukrainian defenses. Now, he didn't get into much detail there, but what do we know about the situation on the ground? What do you make of the fact that Kiev is kind of sounding the alarm here? Is that telling us just how bad the situation is for them?
Yeah, it's really bad. The operational crisis in South Donetsk. I mean, it's gone beyond an operational crisis. It's now becoming a coup de grace in the South, and this all started right in the beginning of this year when Russia broke through the Kiev regime's fortifications and defenses that it had built up for almost a decade in Avdiivka. And then we started talking as Russian forces largely, without any serious defenses in the area, certainly nothing comparable to Avdiivka. We started talking about the Ocheret and the Bloom, right? The operational space that Russia could move into. And then for the past 2 to 3 months, we've been talking about Russia well behind the Kiev regime's defensive lines now was moving on this string of logistics centers, right, in the South Donbass that provided a great deal of the logistics for the rest of the Kiev regime forces remaining in the Donbass. And that was Pokrovsk, Karakhova, and Sleboda. And of those three, now Russia has taken Sleboda, Karakhova. It has all but taken. There's only a couple of streets, from what I understand, still in the Kiev regime hands. It's largely a cleanup operation at this point, and Russian forces are already moving on Pokrovsk. And they're going to do with Pokrovsk what they did with Karakhova and Sleboda, and that's flank it and move on it in multiple directions, while also cutting off its supply lines. At first with artillery and drones, and then moving towards physically cutting it off. And from what we've seen in the past week, the Kiev regime's defenses in the Pokrovsk area, hastily assembled, look a lot weaker than I think a lot of people thought they were, which means that in relative terms for this conflict, Pokrovsk may be over a lot sooner than a lot of people think, certainly in the West. I mean, it's not going to fall in a week or something like that, but by the end of the winter, it could be all but over for Pokrovsk. And that will basically, it does two things. First of all, there is a huge, another further bloom of operational space after Pokrovsk, specifically to the West. There's nothing of any significant defensive value or geographical or topographical obstacles all the way to the Dnieper River, right, to the banks of the Dnieper River, to Dnipropetrovsk. right? And at some points now, Russia is around 10 kilometers or a little less from the Dnipropetrovsk region, from the borders of it. Russia is primed early next year to start moving into Dnipropetrovsk. As well of that, as I said, this will cut off the Kiev regime's logistical supplies to the rest of the forces remaining in the Donbass region to a not 100%, to a very significant degree. And also, Russia is moving in the north, in the southern Kharkov region, towards Kupiansk. It will then be moving on Liman and Izum, and that will cut off the supply lines from the north. And this is all closing in on the Kiev regime's last remaining defensive line in the Donbass region, which is Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. And taking Pokrovsk and taking Kupiansk will allow Russia to then move in on that last defensive line, next year, early next year, and certainly by the end of next year, possibly even by next autumn, the Donbass will be fully liberated from the Kiev regime forces if the trajectory stays the same. And it has to be said that Russian advances are accelerating all the time, right? As is the attrition of the Kiev regime forces, as shown, which is perhaps more important than the territory, because this is a war of attrition that Russia is fighting. That's their strategy. The Kiev regime is increasingly incapable of they're incapable of stopping Russian forces in all but a handful of places. They're increasingly unable to even slow Russian forces down. In the southern Donbass region, Russia is almost limited more by maintaining their own logistics than they are the Kiev regime's defenses.
That's it. I want to say it's shocking to think about, but I guess we've kind of been coming up to this point slowly but surely, getting here, right? That's the war of attrition that you've been talking about for months and months now. And it's also
It's starting
interesting
to pay off.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me how we see these updates from the battlefield, and you would think that the West would be more focused on, okay, what can we do for Kiev on the battlefield? Is there anything we can do? But instead, you've got Kiev and Washington carrying out yet another attack on Russian territory using US-made ATACMS. Now, this one notably targeted southern Russia, nowhere near Kursk. Now you have the Kremlin vowing a response, and anonymous US officials telling media here in the West that they're freaking out because they know that Russia has a fancy new hypersonic ballistic missile system and it could use it on Ukraine in response. Feels like there was a way that all of this could have been avoided for the West, but how do you view this kind of buildup, the warnings that we're getting from the Kremlin and what it could lead to?
Okay, so this is the fourth U.S. ATACMS attack on Russia, on Russia proper, right? Not the Crimea, not the Donbass, which are, of course, are disputed and so forth, but an internationally recognized Russian territory. And it has to be talked about this way, right? It's not Ukraine was allowed, right? This is the U.S., the Biden administration, firing ballistic missiles into the middle of Russia, right? That is, well, into southern Russia in this case. That is what it is. We know this. I mean, it is a U.S. missile fired from a U.S. launch system, the HIMARS. It has U.S. satellite GPS guiding it to its targets. And we know that we've heard not only from President Putin, but also, effectively from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, that it is Western specialists who have to program these missiles, who have to literally input the targeting sequence because of the proprietary classified coding software. It's not something that is or would be provided to Ukrainians. It has to be U.S. military specialists on the ground. Now, there might be a Ukrainian in the vicinity somewhere when these missiles are fired, right? But that fig leaf of proxy doesn't fly anymore. So Russia has reserved the right. They've made clear they consider this an act of war by the United States, by the United Kingdom and France, in reference to similar attacks with the Storm Shadows and Scalp cruise missiles on Russia, right? And they reserve the right to hit back at those countries and their assets around the world. The US and the UK have a lot of military bases around the world that are extremely vulnerable to Russian attacks like this. Now, the Russian response thus far was using this new test in test mode, this new hypersonic intermediate range ballistic missile with a kind of MERV style, multiple warhead that was used on a Kiev regime military industrial facility where missiles, Ukraine's own indigenous missiles, were being assembled. However, and we don't know how Russia is going to respond to these latest attacks. Officially, the target was a military airfield in southern Russia, Taganrog. As from the Russian side, they say that they took out at least 4 of the 6 ATACMS missiles, which Russia's air defense and electronic warfare have long built profiles of these weapons, right? So that's completely believable. They say they diverted the last 2, and supposedly they fell on the parking lot essentially of this airfield and the air production facility in the same location. However, there is the possibility that they weren't aiming at Taganrog at all, because there's a possibility along that trajectory that they might have been stopped there. But what they were actually aiming at is Russia's command HQ of the special military operations in Rostov. That's what a lot of Russian military analysts are saying, which means they were going after top generals, planning facilities, the HQ, if you will, for the entire special military operation. And if that's true, then we can probably expect a more significant Russian response than otherwise. I still believe that they probably won't strike actual US military or NATO military facilities yet, because it's obvious that this is the act of a lame duck administration on its way out the door that is trying to tie the hands, escalate at the last minute to prevent Trump from even making the attempt to de-escalate on the American side. I think they're willing to reserve the right to further response later. But right now, they'll still take it out on the Kiev regime proxies. They may use the Oreshnik again. They may use, Putin has indicated that they have other weapons as yet undisclosed in the same general category that they could deploy. Or Russia already has a really significant quiver of long-range strikes, whether we're talking Kinjals and Zircons and Iskanders, a whole range of possible long-range strike missile capabilities to use. But perhaps it's more important what they hit, right? Mm-hmm. Will they actually target some decision-making centers, right? Will they target secret facilities with NATO personnel in Ukraine? That is more significant at this point. But regardless, as with the last use of the Oreshnik 2 weeks ago, there was a 2-week hiatus between U.S. missile strikes into Russia. The West took entirely the wrong lesson from Russia's active restraint and the demonstrative use of the Oreshnik. They read this as Russian weakness. Russia is weak. They would be perfectly entitled to, we know that, we don't say it, but we know it, to hit us directly. But they're afraid to do that, right? They read Russia's restraint and unwillingness to respond to provocation with the new administration coming in with Russian weakness and fear. And sure enough, here we have the next Russian, the next attack on Russia by the U.S. with ballistic missiles. And so we'll have to see how Russia responds. I predict something similar in the level of restraint, at least not a direct attack on the U.S. or U.S. military bases yet. They'll wait to see if Trump continues the same policy, which is actually doubtful because Trump has one of the only things that he's said about Russia since winning the election. He's come out and said he is against these. He says, why are we sending long range, or missiles deep into Russia? This is a needless escalation. The Pentagon has been clear that they were against this, that this is not going to change the battlefield, that they don't have enough of these missiles, that the ones that they've provided are not enough to change anything, that Russia has moved its airfields, operational airfields for the SMO out of range of the ATACMS, that it's essentially pointless. It is a needless escalation. But that's exactly what the Biden administration wants, a needless escalation, right? Trump, I think, is sending a signal to Russia as well. Limit your response, give me a chance. I don't believe in the 24 hours Trump is going to bring peace. We're all going to be singing kumbaya, but he is at least going to start diplomatic negotiations. That is obvious. How maybe they'll take years to see through their finale, right? There is at least the possibility that he wants to de-escalate from the U.S. side. Whether he'll be able to do that or not with the gaggle of neocons he's gathered around him quite willingly, obviously, that's another question. But Russia is probably willing to limit their response still in light of this power change that's about to take place in the U.S.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. And it's interesting to me, too, to see these statements that Trump is actually putting out there, right? To see the fact that he is saying, why are we doing this, right? He's calling out the Biden administration in at least his own Trump way. I am curious to see what he actually decides to do once he gets in office. But as you have all that going on, I thought it was interesting, as you were noting there, when they're talking about viewing Russia's response as weakness. Well, this week, the mainstream media here in the West has jumped on the bandwagon, right? They are viewing the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Syria as the ultimate weak point for Russia. They're insisting that it was a blow for Putin. That's what they're focusing on, not on all of the Syrian civilians who now are under the control of what is essentially al-Qaeda. How do you view the way that the situation in Syria kind of evolved over the last 2 weeks? I mean, I know that Russia has been a very important ally for Syria, but at the same time, there's only so much that Russia can do. So how do you view kind of how things came to be and, of course, where they go from here?
Yeah, Russia was obviously warning and taking action against this buildup of jihadi forces in Idlib. Back in mid-October, they began heavy airstrikes, helicopter gunship strikes, drone strikes in Idlib. That said, Russia did have a much smaller contingent in Syria now than they did 4 years ago. They did what they could with what they have. However, and Iran was making similar warnings. Iran also had a much smaller military footprint in Syria than they did. Assad was probably responding to backdoor communications with the U.S. to limit the amount of. He was basically drawing some distance between his government and Iran, at least in terms of Iranian troops or popular mobilization units on Syrian territory. Hezbollah had to pull all their troops or most of their troops out of Syria to deal with Israel in the invasion of southern Lebanon. So a kind of perfect storm was created. And what a lot of people don't understand is how badly the Syrian economy was hollowed out by a combination of Western sanctions and the fact that the U.S. illegal military occupation of East Syria is still sitting on all of Syria's oil and wheat fields. The Syrian economy is just in a complete shambles. The people saw no hope. When there's 4 hours of electricity a day in Damascus, the capital city, because They have to import. An oil-producing country has to import, energy that they can't afford, they can't pay for. From around the world, it was just hollowed out. A Syrian army officer was making $30 to $50 a month, while one of the jihadis on the Turkish and Qatari payroll was making $1,500 a month, right? It seems obvious that some combination of Western and Turkish intelligence made a major subversion and co-option campaign against the Syrian military officers, the generals, against Syrian bureaucrats, political civil administration, clan leaders, and the like. It must have been truly massive. And through some combination of buying them out, bribery, blackmail, threats, essentially the majority of the Syrian military was simply withdrawing and standing down. There were thousands. I mean, we now see the aftermath, the videos. Russian soldiers walking through entire fields and buildings where the Syrian military, the Syrian Arab Army, in mass, was stripping off their uniforms, throwing down their weapons, leaving entire fields full of tanks and howitzers and everything else, most of it provided by Russia, and just abandoning it, because it's not something, we're afraid, we don't want to fight, we're abandoning in the middle of the night from the trenches. No, they were ordered to, right? This is subversion. Now, it wasn't everything, or the Tiger forces still fought. The 4th Division did some fighting, but by far it was not enough. And Russia was doing what they could. Iran and Hezbollah were ready to come back into the fray, but it all happened so quickly. The collapse was so complete, so well orchestrated, that there simply wasn't time. Russian Wagner forces were literally on their way and arriving in Maimim as Damascus was falling. And there's just, if the Syrian Arab Army was hollowed out and corrupted and co-opted, there's nothing anyone else could do at that point. So it's a win. Yeah, Russia lost. This was the symbol of their return to the Middle East, of their influence in the Middle East. Certainly a lot of the Gulf states that respected strength are now, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they may be taking a step back now because Russian influence in the region is now obviously lessened. They couldn't sustain this regime. The West is going to read this as weakness. Iran has their supply lines to Hezbollah, seriously in danger now, right? Maybe not 100%, but the axis of resistance is facing crippling. So big loss for Russia, Iran, big loss for the Palestinian people, because now there's, with Hezbollah, crippled into the future because of this, and even the threat of Syria gone, Israel will be able to, finish up with the Palestinians in Gaza and perhaps even the West Bank without any, even threat of interference or even probably less scrutiny involved. And if Hamas is too stupid to recognize that because of their Islamist, beliefs, they've been celebrating the fall of Bashar al-Assad, well, they've got another painful lesson coming to them. So big losers, Russia, Iran, and the Palestinian people as a whole. Big winners, Erdogan, the Turkish Neo-Ottoman Empire is in full bloom. He reversed the situation from 2019 to 2020. He was forced to the Astana framework. So he could very well direct his forces now to the East Syria to deal with the Kurds, the U.S. proxies there. I'm sure he wants to get rid of the Kurds. I'm sure he wants the oil, and the U.S. is scrambling. Blinken is jetting off to try to limit Erdogan's ambitions in that regard. In the long term, I don't think it will be successful. And another big winner, of course, is Israel, who has removed a huge threat or a potential obstacle to themselves in Syria, the supply lines to Hezbollah, and they've made a little bit of a land grab, at least in taking the entirety of the Golan Heights, Mount Hebron, and some of the surrounding areas. I think they'll probably limit themselves there. Tectonic earthquakes in the Middle East. Russia had the starting of a new foundation there, but like everything else in the Middle East, built on sand, and it's all washed away.
Yeah, it was shocking to see how quickly it all happened. And, as you're noting there, I know that there are some people that are celebrating this because they weren't big fans of Assad, but it's like, you look at this new HTS group, they're literally talking about befriending Israel, right? They're not talking about the Palestinian people. They have not been talking about the Palestinians for the last more than a year now.
Has Al-Qaeda ever attacked Israel?
Right.
Which tells you something, right? I mean, literally, this is Al-Qaeda. Even the U.S. has admitted this, right? Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is recognized as a terrorist organization by the U.S., by the U.K., by the United Nations. Jolani himself is as a $10 million bounty out on his head by the FBI. He was the leader of ISIS in Syria, right? Years ago. Then he became the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, now rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And now the Western media, they're not even bothering with some type of, bull feces Syrian council or everything. We're just going to whitewash this Al-Qaeda leader now. He's in charge. and this apologism. Meanwhile, they're completely seeing no evil, hearing no evil, speaking no evil about the dozens and dozens of videos that these jihadis are filming themselves of the summary executions, of the massacres of Alawites and Shia and the other minorities that are under threat. The Christian community in Syria, the Druze. All the minorities are now under severe threat. The new transitional government is 100% diversity. No. Yeah. It's entirely members of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and, of course, all men. And the new justice minister has proclaimed Sharia law, right? They've suspended the constitution and the Syrian parliament for the transition period. But we can expect Jolani to run Syria like he ran Idlib for the last few years, which is, a fundamentalist, Salafist, medieval, twisted conception of actually entirely incorrect interpretation of Islamic history. But that's what these people are. That's why they call them takfiri, right? I mean, that's what this is. If you think the war in Syria is over, think again. The three-way Mexican standoff, the biggest party was removed, right? Syrian government, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah taken off the board. But that still leaves jihadis who have always been at each other's throat, in Idlib, in northern Syria, and Erdogan. But you also have, the U.S. and the Kurds in the east. And obviously, Erdogan hates the Kurds and will have designs on that. Israel now entering the fray in the south, at least to an extent. And the Arab countries, they're going to be taking a look at all of this. And I don't know how involved. Now, they're certainly not going to get involved directly. But they're going to be uncomfortable with this huge advance with Erdogan's influence and power. They don't have the same fond feelings of the Ottoman Empire that they do in Turkey, yeah. Right? They don't have the same historical conception there. I think the Arab states, the Gulf states, had actually come to appreciate Russia's stabilizing influence in Syria. They had restored relations with Assad. Boy, that looks premature now, in looking at it. But they're going to be uncomfortable with Turkey's increased influence and power there as well. So there's still a lot. I mean, I think you can say that Syria is more unstable now than it ever has been. And, the potential to end up like the next failed state of Libya or like Iraq was for more than a decade is still very much out there.
Yeah, certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I think we've learned how quickly things can not only change, but also how it's important to keep an eye on those blind spots because they can come right back around. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive deep dive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.